And yet when it comes to meeting the needs of people in the real world as we know it, it seems that there's hardly ever enough to go around. Those of us who follow the news daily will be familiar with the distressing stories of need and poverty in so many corners of our world. I heard a report just this past week of some persons having been reduced to eating dirt. Yes, my friends, God has blessed us, and He has blessed us bountifully. And yet there continues to be so many cases of need in our world. Hence the theme of our message this morning, the challenge of scarcity. The disciples of Jesus, and John tells us in the gospel story, faced a similar situation of need. After a busy day of meeting the needs of people in the Galilean community, Jesus, with his disciples, we're told, crossed over the Lake of Galilee, hoping to get some peace and quiet. This, however, was not to be, because St. John tells us that a large crowd followed them, having witnessed many of Jesus' earlier miracles. They followed Jesus across the waters, expectantly, eagerly, waiting to receive. Eventually they came to a desert place, and as the day wore on, the crowd grew tired and hungry. And St. John tells us that when Jesus lifted his eyes and saw them, his heart was filled with pity. And so he turned to Philip and he asked, "Where are we going to get bread to feed this large number of people?" That question was posed to Philip because we are told in the Gospels that Philip was from Bethsaida in Galilee, which was a neighboring district, which means that Philip knew the area well. And if anyone knew where to find bread, it ought to be Philip. Hence Jesus' question to him, "Where might we find bread to feed this large crowd?" Philip's response, however, was one of despair. "Are we to find," he says, 200 denarii to buy enough bread to feed this vast crowd? Now you need to have some details to understand the significance of Philip's question. Now a denarii, I'm told, was worth then at least about 8 pence, which was the working day's pay for a grown man. And so what Philip was saying in effect was, it would take the daily wage of a grown man about 6 months for us to raise enough money to buy enough bread to feed this crowd. And even if we're to raise that sum to buy that much bread, would that be enough to feed this vast crowd? So by now you should get the picture that it was indeed a very large crowd. The Gospels tell us that they numbered some 5,000, not including women and children. But just as Philip and Jesus were engaged in this exchange, we're told that another of Jesus' disciples, namely Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, came by. And overhearing the conversation, he remembered that in the crowd he had seen a young lad with his lunch, 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And so typical of Andrew, who was always seeking to help in a difficult situation. He said to Jesus, "There is a lad here with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish." But then even Andrew reflected the despair of Philip, for he concluded, "What are these among so many?" So the picture we have here in this story, my brothers and sisters, is one of a very vast crowd. One account says they numbered, as I said before, 5,000, and that did not include women and children, because in those days the Jews did not permit women and children to eat with men. So the head count was among the men. So 5,000 and counting. But also, in the face of the vastness of this crowd and the magnitude of the need, we are also faced with the meagerness of the resources. 5 barley loaves. That, I'm told, was the food of the very poor. The kind of food, if you brought it out in public, you had to eat it. You didn't want anybody to see you eating barley loaves. But this was the lunch which this little boy had. And Andrew had the presence of mind to suggest that this might be used. Jesus, we are told, responded by saying, "Bring them to me." And he took them in his hands. He looked up to heaven and he blessed them. He gave them to the disciples to be distributed among the crowds. And the gospel writers tell us that they all ate and were satisfied. This is one of the few stories that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. So we must know that the Gospel writers placed a lot of importance on this story. The question is, what are we to make of this story today? How are we to understand and to interpret this story recorded by the Gospel writers of Jesus' feeding of the 5,000? Several suggestions have been offered in terms of an understanding of what actually took place. One of them is that we might see this story as one of the wonder works, one of the mighty works wrought by Jesus, his miracles. It is no secret that Jesus worked many miracles during his ministry. And St. Mark would have us understand that this was but one of them. God's power was mightily at work in Jesus, providing for the needs of the hungry. But there is also another suggestion that what we have here was really a sacramental meal. That is to say, we must not understand, and I'm not telling you which one to go for, I'm just telling you what the suggestions are in terms of what took place. But the second suggestion is that this was in fact a sacramental meal. And when the Gospel writers tell us that Jesus broke off a little piece and gave it to each one of them, and they were satisfied, it doesn't mean that they had a lot to eat. Now when you come to the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, we didn't invite you to a party. So nobody should go away thinking, well look, it's only this they gave me. We know that the sacrament is a symbol. What matters so much is not the bread and the wine that we eat and drink, but rather the presence of Christ in the midst. He fills our hearts and our souls, even as we eat the body and the blood. That's what a sacrament is. And the suggestion is that what happened on that day was that even the little that Jesus gave them left them satisfied, because they knew they had received it from the hand of God. But there is yet another suggestion, namely, that this little boy with his 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish was not the only person present with a meal, but that just about everyone else brought something along as their lunch that day. And when they saw that this little boy was willing to offer up their lunch and share it, they too felt inspired to do the same. And as such, there was enough to feed the large crowd. Now, as I said before, you can take your pick as to which one you will go for. But the story leaves it very clear that whereas the disciples began by complaining about the meagerness of their resources and the magnitude of the need, after Jesus had taken the loaves and the fish and blessed it, the needs were adequately met by the bounty which Jesus offered. And so the real point of this story is that God is able to supply all our needs according to his riches in glory. And there is no telling what he could do in our circumstances of need to meet our needs. But there are several details in this story which are worthy of our note and attention. Not all of them supplied by St. John, but many of them found in the other Gospels, because as I said before, this is one of the few stories which is recorded by all of the Gospel writers. One of the details that I want to point out is that, and this we find in Mark's version of the story, when Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to find bread to feed this large crowd?" Jesus said, "What do you have? Go and see." And St. Mark tells us it was when the disciples went and they checked that they eventually discovered that there was a lad there with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, and was able to bring them to Jesus. The point here is that Jesus worked the miracle on that day using resources which the disciples at first never recognized that they had. And I dare say, my dear brothers and sisters, that the problem of unrecognized resources is an issue which hampers the work of God in so many fields today. There are times when we are challenged to meet a need, and our response is like that of the disciples: what are we going to do it with? How are we going to meet such great a need? In other words, we begin by emphasizing what we do not have. In those situations, we need to hear and to heed the challenge of Jesus. What do you have? Go and see. And just as when Andrew went to check, he discovered that there was a lad there with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, we may yet discover that we do in fact have the resources which can adequately meet our needs. So I want to suggest that we need to look around us and to determine what are the ways in which God has blessed us. What are the resources that we have at our disposal that we can use to meet the needs that we have? You may not have cash, but maybe you have produce in your backyard which can be turned into cash, or which can meet the needs of your family and your community. The question is, do you recognize the hidden resources which you can use to meet your need? The story is told of a little girl who was very sickly, and she heard that her church was raising funds to extend the sanctuary. Sick though she was, she devised a plan that she would raise 52 pennies to help with the extension of the church. As it turned out, she died before the church was actually renovated. And one day her mother found under her pillow 52 pennies with a note to extend God's sanctuary. Here was a little girl, not in the best of health, but she resolved that she could do even the little that she could, raising a penny each month to help with the extension of the sanctuary. And so those 52 pennies, when the church was eventually dedicated, were celebrated because they represented the sacrificial gift of a little sick girl. We may not have much, as was said before, but God has blessed us, and we need to look around us and to find out what do we have that we can use to meet ours and the needs of others.
Amen.
Count your many blessings. Name them one by one, and it may surprise you what the Lord has done. The second detail that I wish to draw to our attention is that when Jesus received the 5 barley loaves and the 2 small fish for all his life. So often we receive great benefits without either acknowledgement or gratitude. No wonder we are so often overcome by need and suffering because we lack that sense of gratitude and acknowledgement. And if you lack that grateful spirit, then the chances are that you will see the blessings around you and you will not even recognize them. You know that is possible.
Yes.
You can have blessings all around you and you're complaining to high heavens. When in truth and in fact, what you need to do is to take the little you have and to offer thanks to God.
Amen.
And then consecrate them to his use.
Amen.
This is what Jesus did. And this is what each one of us ought to do. The third and final detail I want to highlight is that having received the 5 barley loaves and the 2 small fish, and having blessed them, Jesus gave them to his disciples. He gave instructions that the crowd should be seated. And we are told that the disciples ordered them to sit down in rows of 50. And then, and only then, were the bread and fishes distributed among them. Why did Jesus give this instruction? Well, if you've ever had to deal with a large crowd, and worse yet, a large, hungry crowd, you will understand. Now they tell me that a hungry man is an angry man. And you take food out in front of a crowd of hungry people and you don't bring some order to that crowd, then you are inviting chaos. And so Jesus adopted a common sense approach. He first of all sought to organize the crowd before he could distribute the resources. And then he invited the disciples to take those resources and to share them among the crowd. The wisdom in this action is that if Jesus had not taken this action, chances are the first 20 people would have gotten their bellies full and the rest would have gone hungry. That's how crowds behave. And so if you're going to adequately meet the needs of distressed people, you must first of all organize yourself and organize those around you. And this brings me there if you wish to take anything home. Having said that, it also bears noting that anything that you have brought to the altar, once you have placed it here, is no longer yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And so I don't expect anybody to say, when I brought this one, I'm going to sell it.
Right.
I don't need to tell you what happened to Ananias and Sapphira. We don't want that to happen here.
Right. Right.
So let's bring some order into the house of God. I think a word to the wise is normally enough.
Amen.
Suffice it to say that though this little boy had only a meager 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, having dedicated them to God, God used them as the basis of a miracle. I close with these words which I found somewhere some time ago. Do not ask how many thousands can be fed with food so slim. Give to him your loaves and fishes. Leave the miracle to him. Amen.